All right. So, hello. Ooh, that's loud. So, hi. As Wes mentioned, I'm still Andy Starks. Um, I want to start my presentation off by first seeing audience participation. This part always goes the best, but I want to know if anybody here is willing to share just like a brief sentence on what they think IPMX is. Like, what pops into your mind when you hear about IPMX? Anyone? Look at the Vitech guys. Go ahead.
It's getting uncompressed audio and video on a network and making it work easily.
Okay, easily, right? So it's like SMPTE 2110, but easier, right? Kind of, I mean, and uncompressed and compressed, or you said uncompressed, it's also compressed, but okay, that's a good one. Anybody else had anything that pops in their mind when they think of IPMX? So I'll share some things. That's a good one. Um, First one is you kind of hear it's like, if SMPTE 2110 is like SDI over IP, IPMX is like HDMI over IP, right? Another thing I hear a lot is, oh, it's SMPTE 2110, but there's no PTP. And that's wrong. There's a story there, and I'll go into a little more detail on that one later. Or like you mentioned, like a Blue Jeans version, or easier than SMPTE 2110, right? But or an open standard version of kind of what NDI was trying to do. So there's a lot of different ways to think about IPMX, and none of those are completely wrong or anything. For us, when we first started, we actually called it SMPTE 2110 and NMOS plus a bunch of other stuff you need. And then we came up with a name. And as we kind of evolved along the way, we've had testing events, the NFL, we have, another one in Munich that we did very recently. We have another one that's coming this year. I'm wondering if, oh, it said Munich here. Yeah, that should actually say NFL facility. But anyway, we have a lot of, as we went along the way here, our own idea and our own understanding of IPMX have kind of evolved along with it. And I want to share a little bit about some of the realizations and the things we've learned along the way and what really the difference between IPMX and SMPTE 2110 and NAB24 are and how they all work together. So one of the first key insights that we had was that the Pro AV market is way bigger. In fact, it's almost exactly 10 times bigger than what we call the broadcast market. And by the broadcast market, we really are talking about that market where content is the point, right? That's the business of content. Whereas in the Pro AV world, the content is really in support of the business or in support of the mission of, the school or the business or the bank or, whoever's using the Pro AV or audio and video. The key there, though, in a market that big, is that the needs are extremely diverse. There's a lot of overlap with broadcast. In fact, I like to push back a little bit when people say broadcast and Pro AV because it in some ways implies that in Pro AV they don't do what they do in broadcast. But of course, there's a tremendous amount of live production happening in the Pro AV world. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap in both directions. And in fact, if you think about it, there's a lot of Pro AV equipment that a broadcaster purchases as well, for their own internal use, or also they're using Pro AV equipment literally inside their production. So the overlap there's quite a bit of it. But this all comes down to is that in the Pro AV market, it has to be an extremely accessible technology. And to kind of illustrate my point here, we have a stadium here, but we could have a hospital, we could have, a university campus, and we see all the different ways in which AV from broadcast, outside broadcast trucks and everything else to, digital signage, security, just a million ways that AV over IP is used. And to that point, I guess, the question is, now that we are moving away from a baseband world and into a world where everything is on an IP network, why do we have these different ways of doing things, ways of discovery, ways of registration, different ways to format the same basic technology? So IPMX, kind of shifting into, what IPMX is, it's not SMPTE 2110 and NAB24 or HUBHT. It's not what standards and specifications that make up the technologies that we use are designed to describe a certain way of doing things, right? But in and of themselves, they don't necessarily make an interoperable system. So if you think about it, with AES 67, you can take that technology, wrap it around a control system, change it a little bit, and what you have is Dante, right? Or you can look at HDBaseT in the Pro AV world. Now, this is a technology that ran over Cat5. It's not an IP-based technology, but it was a technology. A lot of products out there that were HDBaseT products weren't actually interoperable. They used the same technology, but in the early days, they weren't actually interoperable with each other. So they're extremely general. They may be used for proprietary systems. They may be used in open systems that are meant to be interoperable. But it doesn't always work that way, right? For IPMX, our whole mission is interoperability. So if you look at models that have had to scale up to very large, systems, we can think of, I think, my two favorite examples are USB and Wi-Fi. If you and I can go out and we can make a device today that uses 802.11a and b, does all the things correctly, connects to other Wi-Fi devices, but we cannot put this logo on that device unless we meet certain performance criteria, unless we go through a process of testing, and there's everything that goes into making an actual Wi-Fi device that is interoperable. And so that's kind of a model that we've been looking at, or that we've been kind of following for the IPMX story. So for IPMX, we define a set of standards and testing and labeling that ensures that devices can reliably exchange content. So that not only means the actual format, but it also means, how does the device turn on? How does it, what features of NMOS does it support? What are the various details that every device must support as a baseline? And then what are the ways in which we can extend and expand the capabilities of the device and still be interoperable within the IPMX system? Sort of to break this down into a graphic, you can see here, you kind of look at, you imagine a product with IPMX, right? And there's all kinds of vendor special sauce on the top, right? They've got proprietary protocols and proprietary features on there. But the baseline IPMX portion really is part of every IPMX device, is really kind of summed up in the NMOS control plane, right? So NMOS defines a set of specifications for discovery, connections, all the basic control plane stuff. And that's a key part of IPMX. Every IPMX device must include the basics of NMOS that are defined in the IPMX definition in order to be called an IPMX device. Then on top of those baseline requirements, we might have features, but a key element of IPMX is profiles. So something that IPMX has that, say, AES67 has similar things, but what IPMX defines is a set of profiles. So these are interoperable groups of products. So if you think about it, two products have to exchange content together. The key thing that they need to share is uncompressed or some kind of codec, right? So IPMX defines, say, like a uncompressed profile, a full bandwidth profile, uncompressed audio. All of these are profiles. These are content feature group or content groups here that define that this product that supports, say, like the uncompressed profile will work with another IPMX product that supports that same profile. And then in addition to that, we have features that kind of cut across profiles. So I might have a device that supports uncompressed video and another one that supports, say, a full bandwidth codec like JPEG XS or some codec like that. And it also supports, say, USB. So across any of these profiles, it'll support USB extension. So this is the ability to use a mouse and keyboard on one end and have it control a device on the other end. IPMX has mechanisms for that as well. And that's an example of one of the features that kind of gets defined within the product. So that's kind of a breakdown of how it's organized. Now within a codec, you might have a product that supports the same codec or uncompressed video, but that doesn't mean that everything about those two products is going to work perfectly, right? So I might have one product that doesn't support UHD. I've got a product that's on a 5 gig connection, and I've got another one that's on a 10 gig connection. And I might have different features of my codec that are supported. So in that control plane, that baseline control, that base level control plane that IPMX supports with NMOS has to be able to negotiate those different feature sets even within the codec, right? So we have mechanisms within IPMX to say, okay, this is on a 10 gig device and this is on a 100 gig device, and the maximum codec, profile that it can support is, X, and so they negotiate together. They know what each of them has for resolutions, and they're able to make a connection, right? So interoperability means that within a profile, there's at least one resolution that will work. There's at least one way to get content, video content and audio content across. There might be better ways, maybe both devices support even higher levels of capabilities, but at least there's one resolution, so at least you can get that one signal across, right? And then the second thing it says is that for each format supported, or each content format supported by both devices, there's at least one connection point there as well. So if I can support 1080p on device A and 1080p on device B, and I've got the same profile, and my codec implementations might support different things, there's at least one base level, codec implementation. So I know if the resolutions and frame rates match, I'm going to get video across. And then from there, you can negotiate up and down depending on your use case and your needs, right? So let me see here. Yeah, so a profile is an this is kind of restating what I was just saying here. So a profile really is an incomplete list of things to be negotiated, and I'll just mention a couple of them here. So bandwidth I mentioned earlier, but also timing. With IPMX, I'll mention a little bit more about that. In a SMPTE-2110 system, typically you're synchronized, right? So there are some systems out there that can handle asynchronous content on a SMPTE-2110 system, but it's more kind of like an error condition than it is a normal expected way to work of things working. IPMX actually does a lot with asynchronous video to make it work really well, even actually in live production environments. And I'll explain that near the end here when I talk about RTCP sender reports. But then we also need to negotiate other features that each device might support as well. So when we talk about all these definitions and profiles and everything, I can bring you around. We can see all the organizations involved in here. AIMS, we're involved in writing this document. So the main, call it a contract or main document that's your go-to place to describe exactly what IPMX is, exactly what its purpose, its baseline requirements are. And then those reference all the specs that are created in VSF and AMWA and SMPTE and other organizations. So we have the specs, the standards, best practices documents, the logo, boilerplate text that goes along with it, all of that's referenced by the specification document. And then the standards are created in SMPTE, and the specifications and those other kinds of documents are created in VSF and AMWA. So in terms of interoperability between the systems, this is where it gets kind of interesting and also kind of exciting. So because of the way IPMX was designed, any IPMX device where the content profile matches what the SMPTE-2110 device is doing. So the SMPTE-2110 device supports -22, and the IPMX device supports that same codec, right? Every IPMX receiver will be able to receive that content. So if I'm transmitting content that can physically fit on the pipe connected to this IPMX receiver, it will be able to receive it. That's part of IPMX. However, the reverse is not necessarily true, right? So IPMX works with asynchronous video, and so your SMPTE-21 receiver may or may not work with that, right? Many receivers will work with it, but again, typically that's not the typical use case, right? But because of IPMX's origins, because 99% of it is at SMPTE-2110, it starts with SMPTE-2110, and the extensions are thoughtfully put in there to be sort of backwards compatible with SMPTE-2110, we're going to find a lot of devices that will support both SMPTE-2110 and IPMX. So you'll be able to change them in different modes, and we're defining how that mode change takes place and also how that's represented. So you'll be able to see, okay, this device supports both SMPTE-2110 synchronous and IPMX asynchronous as like a sender. But going into that a little bit more detail, there's kind of two ways to look at it. You can think about it like the IPMX device flips into SMPTE-2110 mode and sends a 2110-20 stream to the SMPTE-2110 device, and it's all good. The other way to look at it is that actually, it stays more or less as an IPMX device, but now the timing matches this timing specifications for SMPTE-2110. And there's a subtle difference there in that you're getting a SMPTE or a RTCP sender report in the second version there. I'm going to take some water here, 1 second. And the reason why I want to mention this is because it's one of my favorite features of IPMX. And this is where we talk about PTP. So I had one manufacturer, I called them up, and I worked for Macnica, and I was telling them like, hey, our PTP has got an issue or whatever, and they're like, PTP, we don't care about PTP. Like they were doing an implementation testing on it. They're like, our customers don't want PTP. PTP is oh man, this looked better earlier, by the way. I'm sorry that this looks like crap. I can't tell you how much time I spent adding spaces to this, and then I guess the font messed up here. But so this is supposed to look like a perfectly byte-aligned diagram here. Yeah, Jean would probably be really mad at me because he took this from him. But I'm sorry about that. But anyway, this is going to get worse as I go here. But this is an RTCP sender report. Up here we have the header, we have the timing section, and then we have the IPMX info block extension. And I'll go through each here. So the timing area here. So this is the thing that I think a lot of people miss about IPMX. Let's say you've got an asynchronous system. You've got a bunch of HDMI sources coming in, right? So no need for PTP, right? Well, maybe. If you're actually taking those asynchronous sources in on your live production system, now you've got your media clock for that content locked or with the PTP data inside of it as well. So now you know the precise frame rate and the relative time to the PTP clock. So your receiving switcher or processing device knows each precise frame rate and knows exactly when that frame was in time, and so then can very quickly understand what the different content it's dealing with is, even though the content is coming from a different frame rate, right? So in that way, you can minimize the recovery time when you're switching sources, or you can mix content really easily and know where they are, all in an effort to keep the latency as low as possible. You're always going to have one extra frame of latency when you're asynchronous, but when you're taking in a bunch of asynchronous sources and doing processing and coming back out again, when you have all that timestamp information, it makes it much easier to keep the latency as tight as possible. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. So when people say, oh, IPMX doesn't need PTP, yeah, it's optional. But even in asynchronous systems, it can be really, really helpful. And this is the kind of hard math that you do when you're creating standards and not just making a product. They actually had to think through all this stuff. When people use AV over IP systems now that lack that data, the latency just skyrockets. And a lot of applications, you end up having to do a lot of work to get everything back in sync. The second cool thing I wanted to talk about, I wish this was better formatted, is the IPMX header info. So we put in basically a reference clock stream, so we can tell you what clock it is that we're referencing and give it a name there. But the coolest part, I think, is the media info block. So it's the year 2024, and SMPTE 2110 is a major standard, and it doesn't have self-describing streams. Like, there's no way for you to know, looking at a SMPTE 2110 stream, unless you know where the STP file is, there's no way to know what you're looking at, right? And oftentimes, if you're an engineer, it's really helpful to know that. Because if we always send RTCP sender reports, we always have the media info block, which has information like what codec, it has the resolution, frame rate, the basic information of what you're looking at. So that can be really helpful when doing stream recovery. Now, why do we put that in the RTCP sender report? The reason why is because in the Pro AV world, if I'm on this laptop and I switch over to my favorite video game, Factorio, and I'm full screen, my full screen video game might be in a different resolution than my desktop. So when I switch those resolutions, my laptop isn't going to go contact the NMOS controller and tell it to take the streams down and then reconnect later. It's just going to change the resolution and without talking to the controller at all. So we could have gone through and had done all that through NMOS, which we do, but we changed the STP file and we changed the media info block information down here so that we can give the system what it needs to make a very quick change instantly. So when the computer changes the resolution, the receiver knows instantly what resolution it needs to be, and it can recover really quickly. So that's why we put it in there, but it also gives you self-describing streams as well. So even in the SMPTE 2110 environment where you're not going to be switching resolutions like that, or at least you better not, having that media info block in there makes it easier for system doing troubleshooting, system analysis, and other things like that. So that is my presentation. And wrapping up here, so SMPTE 2110 and AES 67 today in the wild, there's common use patterns, right? So when I say AES 67, you guys all kind of in your mind can think of level A, B, and C. With SMPTE 2110, it's always a specific set of resolutions. There's usually -7 involved, but the standards themselves are really, really wide. There's a lot of ways to implement and a lot of ways you can do things. IPMX constrains that kind of world and puts a baseline requirement in place and adds profiles to it. And that's what those groups of products, those groups of interoperable products are organized into those profiles. So IPMX devices can receive SMPTE 2110 and AES67 content, and mostly devices will not be okay with IPMX asynchronous content unless there's time-based correction built into them. And we anticipate there will be a lot of IPMX devices that will also implement SMPTE 2110 on the sending side of them. And RTCP sender reports can be used even in SMPTE 2110 systems. SMPTE 2110 and AES67 both say that you have to be okay with receiving RTCP sender reports even if you drop them on the floor and don't do anything with them. So by using those RTCP sender reports, you get a little extra information that can be helpful even in a live production system. So I'm sorry I'm a little rushed through my presentation here, but I appreciate you guys sticking with me, and any questions?